to the brain.
And I'm sorry if you said this a couple minutes ago. You said you're focused on the developmental side. What exactly does that entail?
Yeah. So if you think about it, like it's kind of like a spectrum. So you have your brain and you're developing normally, and you have proteins and things happening to your brain then. And then as we get older, those proteins can start to have a different function. They can misfold, they accumulate, and then that causes disease. So it's a spectrum like that. We tend to focus more on the developmental side of that. So understanding how this protein functions normally and how we can regulate that protein so that when you get into a disease state, we can essentially think of new treatments based on things that we know that regulate that protein's ability to do its job.
Do you have any examples of that currently? Doesn't have to be with anything like Alzheimer's, but just an example of a developmental side where when the protein changes, how you can affect it later?
Yeah, so I guess I can kind of talk a little bit about my master's thesis, which touched on this, and I won't get too into detail because it's not published data yet,
Okay.
hopefully soon. But essentially what we found was that there was a particular protein that when when we took away that protein from the cell, it stopped producing the tau protein, which is our protein of interest. So if you think about it in that context, if a cell, as you get older, accumulates too much tau protein, that's what you see in like Alzheimer's disease. If you can find a way to turn off the cell's ability to produce tau protein at all, you could theoretically slow down the progression of the disease. And that's very, very general and very basic, but that's kind of the idea. If you can find ways to regulate the cell's ability to produce a protein, if it starts to accumulate too much of it that is misfolded or working correctly or whatever else, the more you add to that system, the worse it's going to get. So if you can turn that off, you might be able to help slow down the disease.
And so are not just you guys, but in general, is the research being done focusing on experimental drugs that would do that? Or I mean, like you could look at Elon Musk with Neuralink. Is it manufacturing? Is it artificial wiring? Is it drugs that you guys are trying to stop this protein from being made? How exactly is that all going about?
I think eventually it would be more like a drug target, but it's very, very early on in the research, and a lot has to go between seeing that something has a connection with something else to making a drug that fixes it. There's a lot of things that cause a disease. It's more than just, oh, you have too much protein. It's also the protein's not working correctly. The protein's causing other protein to misfold. The cell can't clear out the protein, so the cell dies. Other cells are taking up the protein that aren't supposed to. So you can't just target one part of the pathway. You have to target multiple steps. So this would just be like one small part of this disease pathway.
And I would say a lot or a majority of brain disease is it, or is it, I guess this is more of a question because I don't know, is it genetically, like is Alzheimer's, is other brain diseases besides like traumatic brain injuries, are they genetic? Are they passed down hereditary? Or is it something that is it specific to your own genomes? How exactly does that all work out? Because I would feel like a lot of them are probably hereditary, right?
So it really depends. So there definitely are genetic components, but there are also plenty of examples where it's just completely sporadic and it's random. One of the best examples of this is prion diseases, which the most well-known is like mad cow disease. That's called bovine spongiform encephalopathy. That can happen completely spontaneously. So it could happen to anyone at any time, and there's no real predisposition to it. But there are also genetic forms of prion diseases where it's passed down hereditarily. So it really just depends on the disease. There are some families that have one person that have had AD or Alzheimer's disease and never have another person again. There are some that every single generation there's some. So it's kind of luck of the draw, which is not, we don't know exactly why sometimes it's genetic and sometimes it's not.
Yeah, that makes sense. And something that fascinates me too is we tend to attribute the brain organ with, well, we have to, with our own subjective consciousness and what exists in this kind of weird, like metaphysical realm, like being a person, almost like how you almost feel like you're sitting inside of a body. You're not part of the body sometimes. And so, a question I have for you is, how does disease of the brain affect a subjective person's almost like their well-being and how they exist and what they remember? Because we see with like Alzheimer's, people forget like even their own kids and things like that. And it seems that is would be way more connected with brain diseases because of that connection between consciousness and memory and brain function. But is it all disease? Does every disease have an effect on the consciousness when it's in the brain? Does it just depend? Because I feel like most of them would, right?
Yeah, and you're right, it absolutely does depend. It's all about the regions that are affected by the disease. So when we talk about diseases like Alzheimer's disease or other dementias, those are going to be affecting the hippocampus, which is where memories are stored and created and so on and so forth. So when you're hitting the hippocampus really hard and you're getting rid of or killing all of the neurons in that area, that's why you have problems with memory. Versus if you have something like CTE, a lot of times there are behavioral components to that, behavioral changes, particularly with aggression. Those could be other areas of the brain. I don't know, again, specifically which areas are affected, but I know that usually with disease, when you see like clinical symptoms that you're talking about affecting consciousness and memory and thoughts and so on, it's all about where the disease is actually hitting in the brain.
And obviously, most of them would hit different specific places. So right now, you said you're focusing on developmental diseases. Besides what we're talking about right now, what are some other diseases that you were specifically like studying, and what is so interesting about them to you?
Yeah, so I'm actually starting to shift my project a little bit away from development and normal function into looking more at what we call primary tauopathies. So Alzheimer's disease is actually a secondary tauopathy, meaning that tau itself is not the only protein that causes the disease. So with AD, you also have beta amyloid, which is the other big player, and that's kind of making a lot of waves right now because of the new drug that just came out that targets beta amyloid. So tau is kind of like the understudy and the less well-known child in that disease, if you will. But there are a lot of diseases that are actually primarily tau focused, particularly progressive supranuclear palsy or PSP and corticobasal degeneration, which is CBD. And what makes these different is actually astrocytes, which are another type of cell in the brain, are predominantly affected rather than neurons. So with AD, we think about neurons being the primary degeneration, versus in PSP and CBD, you see astrocytes, which are accumulating this tau protein, and it's causing problems with astrocytes being able to do their jobs.